Evening, everyone. I'm really pleased to be here tonight. If you hear fireworks in the background, those are all going off in my area. I think people are celebrating the election results. I'm really pleased to be here tonight with Ruby Wallace and Jill Quigley, both female artists doing work in an area that's really close to my heart, and that's the area of landscape photography. And I think they're both putting a very different spin on what that means, what it means to be in a landscape and to be in a landscape with a camera. The presentation this evening is going to go in the following way. Each artist is going to do a short 10-minute presentation about their work. We'll be in conversation with each other for about 20-25 minutes, and then there'll be an interval at the end of the talk for you all to ask questions. I understand there's a button down the bottom of your screen that says Q&A, and you can enter questions there. And after, when the question period opens up, we will open up that panel, and I think the most popular questions will rise to the top, and we will discuss those. Okay, so let's begin with Jill. She's going to give us a short presentation on her work. Jill is from Donegal, Ireland, and she works in the landscape that's local to her. And I'll leave her to introduce herself and talk to you about her work.
Hello. Yeah, so my name is Jill Quigley. I'm going to be talking about two projects that I made in the local area in Donegal where I grew up. I was drawn to make work in these areas because the area you grew up, you're very familiar with, and you're comfortable, I think, exploring that. But you feel comfortable enough to work there. But yeah, there's still scope for you to explore. So the first project I'm going to talk about is called Cottages of Quigley's Point. This is a series that depicts interventions I made in abandoned rural houses in the area. The work was made partly in relation to the wistful reading of these old cottages as harking back to the notion of a simpler way of life and to an uncluttered, unspoilt countryside. I was much more interested in encountering these buildings in the present, so the redundant nature provided an opportunity to engage rather than simply observe. The interventions are intended to undermine any formal reading of the pictures as descriptions of ruins. There was also a strong personal desire to make marks in the environment, to create a kind of evidence that I had been there. Taking photos, for me anyway, is quite a possessive act, and these abandoned houses allowed me to indulge that impulse to inhabit, although perversely in this case in a manner that most people would never notice. So here's an example of the kind of house that I'm talking about. It's a typical two-roomed cottage. Obviously very simple kind of a house, sometimes slightly more elaborate. So part of the process for this project was wandering around the local area, looking for suitable houses. So this meant a lot of walking kind of up back lanes or hill roads, just looking out for anything. Obviously, that was an abandoned house that I'd be able to access. Peering into people's yards, see if they had anything, or into fields. If I could find out who owned the building, then I would try and get in touch and get permission to access it. A lot of the time, though, these buildings are in the middle of nowhere and there was nobody around to ask. So the interiors of these buildings, there was a big variety in the amount of stuff that you would find inside. For example, this one was largely untouched. Everything in it was just decaying. This one is an interesting mixture of domestic remnants and farm supplies. Quite a few of these old houses are used by farmers for storage or sometimes for keeping animals in. Others had nothing left but the structures of the building, slowly being taken over by nature. The experience of exploring inside these buildings was sort of a mixture of excitement, curiosity, and disgust. You're always expecting creatures to come out of everywhere. And the furniture was always squelching underneath you. You were always getting covered in mildew. The nature of the interventions were informed by the elements of the interiors. Bright spray paints and craft materials are chosen to create an obvious contrast with the fading shades of the walls. A lot of the images are focused on the fireplaces as a constant in most of the rooms, but often there were other interesting arrangements as well. The images are all taken with a flash and often with things thrown into the air to be recorded as movement. It was important to fix the images in that split second of exposure, to pull the scene out of time and capture it in a unique state. The movements also highlighted my presence and dispelled any possible notion of a dispassionate observer. I very much co-opted the freedom of these spaces to create a kind of a fantasy world that existed only in the form of the pictures. So the second series I'm going to show is called Rural Fluorescent. And this project looks at functional farm buildings in the landscape. It originated in my fascination with these reflective materials that farmers have adopted. So I thought they were ridiculously aesthetic, yet are used for the entirely practical reason of making things clearly visible for safety reasons. I made use of similar reflective materials to augment farm buildings. These constructions that are built to embody their purpose only, with no hint of decoration or frivolity. Tinted light from my camera flash was used to unify the color palette across a set of images. The main intention was to merge the functional with the playful. Most of the work was made on my father's farm, so I was contrasting our different experience of it. For him, it's a place of work. Whereas for me, it was a place where I could experience and explore.
I'm going to turn over to Ruby now, who will also give a 10-minute presentation of her work. Ruby is another artist working predominantly in the landscape of her local area in County Donegal in Ireland. And I'll let her tell you a little bit more about exactly what she does in those landscapes and the work she's been doing recently.
Thanks a lot, Eugenie. Hi, everyone, and a big thanks to Belfast Photo Festival for inviting me along. I'm delighted to be here with Eugenie Schinkel and Jill Quigley this evening. So I'm going to talk about a project that I'm working on at the moment. Okay, during lockdown, I started walking at night to gain space really from domestic life and caring full-time for my for my 2-year-old daughter. And I'm sure quite a lot of people have been out walking lately. I began to take these photographs as I walked through the city. The quietness and shadowy atmosphere has become mesmerizing, and I began to experiment with how the camera would respond to the hedgerows and pathways. I've been looking at the figure of the flaneur and the flaneur for the past few years through several projects, drawing on methodologies of movement, psychogeography, and new ways to engage with landscape. Michel de Certeau writes of the flaneur as a voyeur god who sees everything without being seen. Walter Benjamin calls him a master collector of fragmented images to be put together as to evoke the feeling of mastery over the whole city. Photography, of course, has a historical relationship to the voyeur, entwined with power and the relevance of who holds the camera. The flaneur positions himself, escaping the domestic realm, free to wander and gaze as he pleases. This hasn't traditionally been such an accepted practice for women. I've been keeping this image making as fluid as possible, working quickly and taking images with a flash, working with closeness as opposed to distance and an objective view. Formally, I'm not so concerned with the image's technical perfection. I'm more interested in focusing on the textures, details, and weather conditions, tones of night sky, and phenomena arising from the walks. I've been photographing trees, pylons, hedgerows, urban grasses within a close radius. I want to communicate to a sense of moving through the city and how the dark changes our perception and our sensuous relationship to it. I've also been working with a haptic approach, paying attention to the sense of touch within the experience of photography, how vision and the photographic document can connect to the other senses. As Laura U. Marks suggests, the eyes themselves can act like organs of touch. I'm thinking of the camera then as an apparatus, as an extension of vision. The writer Felina Sun responded to the images spontaneously with an essay. We began a collaboration. Her words energized me to continue with night walking. She was also walking in a small town 200 kilometers away in Leitrim. She wrote of these images: an electrical pylon, a tree, a cluster of leaves are captured from below. The pylon, a skeletal leviathan, red speckles cohere on second glance into the reflected backlights of cars. Stark white trunks, furry serpentine branches, scaly canopies. What are everyday aspects of landscape we take for granted become uncanny, apprehended as something other. Felina's essay is titled "A Woman Walks Alone at Night with a Camera" and has now become the title of the whole project. The title is subverted from the 2014 film A Girl Walks Home Alone at Night, directed by Anna Lily Amirpour. The main character, Girl, is a vampire with the appearance of a young woman who roams the streets on a skateboard in search of the veins of bad men. Recently, my practice has become increasingly collaborative, operating through conversations with other artists and writers to look at feminist revisions of historical narratives and depictions of places. I'm interested in an investigation of intersectional viewpoints and voices to disrupt the dominance of a singular gaze and traditional perspective. The images also became a reflection on biodiversity as the city ground to a halt during the lockdown and the verges and pathways exploded into plant life, causing me to think about rewilding and a limit on human management of the ecosystem, the sense of what it would be like to just let things be. In Feral, Georges Monbiot writes about the act of rewilding, re-involvement in nature, not just through ecosystems and reintroduction of plants and species, but also through human beings re-engaging with the landscape. I've become increasingly aware of the difference in gendered experience of space and the city, observing my bodily reactions to being out alone at night, and the heightened awareness of internalized narratives of fear, which I know are true for all genders, but for women, this threat is statistically more to do with sexual violence. Rebecca Solnit writes a lot about this in her 2014 book, Men Explain Things to Me. I've noticed a low-grade threat and a rise in adrenaline. I've used my own body as a barometer, measured the increased beating of my heart, the sensations and the need to move quickly in and out of locations. As Felina Sun writes, a woman in the city at night is not without danger. Most women can recall an occasion when they didn't feel safe, slipping scissors into their pockets or knuckling keys. Some of these fears are surely to do with the information absorbed through media from a very young age. Programming embedded as a mental map of safety and danger that every woman carries in her mind. As Leslie Kean asked in Feminist City, floating questions resound. Why are you walking alone at night? Why did you take a shortcut? She observes that there's no sense in hanging about or loitering. I want to push these perceptions and use this image making as an action to reclaim spaces, the act of photography and the thrill of moving through the darkness and the shadows. During the Industrial Revolution, there was strict divisions of class, and women walking the streets might often be mistaken for streetwalkers, disorderly women, or sex workers in contemporary terms. Freedoms were heavily limited. In Virginia Woolf's essay, Street Haunting, A London Adventure, Woolf is the hauntess, participating in the public world, released from the domestic world. To wander, to stroll, reclaiming the position of the flaneur, reclaiming the night. When in 1831, George Sand wanted to experience Paris life, she did it dressed as a boy. She writes, "No one looked at me, no one found fault with me. I was an atom lost in an immense crowd." This is an ongoing project. The darkness is much more present now that it's winter, and I've also begun cycling and swimming at night, enjoying the slippages between the conscious and unconscious modes of seeing and experimentation with the photograph. Woolf's hauntess transgresses the position of male privilege and reclaims the gaze, also allowing herself to play and embody various passers-by, imagining their inner lives and releasing herself from traditional gender constructs. She writes, "What greater delight and wonder can there be to leave the straight lines of the personality and deviate into these footpaths that lead beneath brambles and thick tree trunks into the heart of the forest where live those wild beasts, our fellow men. That is true. To escape is the greatest of pleasures," she writes. "Street haunting in the winter, the greatest of adventures."
That's brilliant. Thank you both very much. There's so much to get into in terms of a conversation. It's really hard to know where to start. I think what strikes me so much about both of your practices is the extent to which you're both taking things that are familiar and making them unfamiliar. And in both cases, there's a link to domestic environments as well. Jill, in your case, entering abandoned domestic environments, and Ruby, in your case, going out into the local landscape to kind of escape domesticity. So I guess I wanted to just throw that idea there as a way of starting the conversation, this idea of the domestic and the unfamiliar and the way that those two things come together in both of your practices. Jill, was that something that you thought about when you started doing these works?
I think I started by looking for, well, just spaces where I could start thinking about a new way of photographing in the local area. Once I started exploring in these houses, yeah, they did offer the kind of scope I was looking for, I guess. They weren't just empty boxes like a shed would be. There was elements of, elements that you could interact with. Hinted, I guess, previous inhabitants, previous lives. It wasn't something I wanted to bring in overtly, but at the same time, it brings a lot more depth to the photographs. It gave me things to play off when I was interacting with the buildings. I guess you could read into it the fact that there's so many fireplaces. That, yeah, it is in a way a search for kind of a disappeared domesticity.
There's a kind of poignancy of going into an abandoned home and of finding people's leftover possessions and the traces of these lives. Was that something, because I know you described what you were doing in these places as quite performative and that you were sort of bouncing off these things. Was there that sense, again, you know, looking at this notion of the unfamiliar and of this strangeness of an abandoned environment? Was that part of the experience for you? Because the experience is something that I'd like to talk to both of you about as well.
Yeah, it was an extension of the feeling of exploring I had, I guess. I think, like myself, I'm quite cold with it. I don't feel the melancholy as much as some people do when they explore these buildings. I do find it fascinating, but I don't see a point in preserving these remnants very much.
It seems like you kind of act to refresh that old trope or something, you know, the nostalgia of the cottages and everything falling apart, and you come in and make these interventions that absolutely blow the thing apart. And you know, it creates such a great juxtaposition what you do. It's so playful, you know.
Yeah.
Like, it's interesting that you say you feel quite cold towards it, like it just doesn't tap into that nostalgic emotion for you being in those places. In fact, maybe it just annoys you, or you know.
What I appreciated most was just the freedom to have that different experience of a place. Actually think of it as something that you can interact with instead of just observe. So yeah, that was the main thing for me. Just being able to take it a little bit further.
Are you usually on your own when you're doing that?
Can I just, Ruby, I wanted to actually push on this idea a little bit with
Sorry.
you as well. So do you mind if I ask you a question
Yeah.
about that? Because what I find interesting in your practice is that you said, you know, the walking alone at night, you say that this practice began as a way of getting out of a domestic environment, just for a little bit of release and me time. And of course, once you leave an environment at night in a city, you become the person on the outside looking in. You know, you find yourself, I mean, I find myself really drawn to the windows of other people's homes and looking into these domestic environments. But I mean, that's not what you chose to photograph. You chose to photograph things, pylons and plants, and you're working with angles that make them look quite alien and unfamiliar. And I wanted to sort of run that sort of thought by you about, again, the strategy of defamiliarization.
Yeah, I think because during lockdown it was so confined. And then, you know, so life was so domestic and almost, and very challenging as well, because with a small child, it's really challenging on your time and your creativity. So being able to get out was quite thrilling in a way, you know, even for a short amount of time. And then I suppose just being drawn almost intuitively to different things as they emerged and arose, like the pylons, like the trees. And then they seem to loom from above in some way, I think. It was just kind of allowing that expanded perception from going out of a very small domestic space into a more, almost like a wild space, even though it was very urban, and it's kind of like on the outskirts of the city in Galway.
Yeah. Can you, just for some of our viewers who may not be familiar with your local area, it's quite a small city. You're not in a major city like London, so you can get to the outskirts, peripheries quite easily, can't you?
Yeah, I'm in Galway, which is in the west of Ireland. It's a pretty small city. So you can walk, you know, across it pretty easily. A lot of those photographs were actually taken close to home, you know, maybe within a 3 or 4 kilometer radius for walking. And sometimes I'd go a little bit out of my comfort zone and find that I realized I'd just gone a little bit too far. I wanted to get back. So yeah, they were kind of, I suppose, experiential adventures into the undergrowth.
When you say getting out of your comfort zone, that's something else that I wanted to push on, because I mean, we are talking here specifically about women's experience of landscape, and it is different. As a landscape photographer myself, I'm aware that the dangers that we face in the landscape are different in many ways than men do, and that statistically, far fewer women are actually engaging in landscape-based practices than men. And so when you said, you know, I felt some evenings I'd gone a little bit too far, I immediately started thinking about these feelings of anxiety that we, you know, that I've certainly experienced, and that play into the practice and that restrict us in certain ways in terms of the way we can engage with the landscape. And I wondered if you could both sort of speak to that. Ruby, could you talk about this idea of feeling like you'd gone too far, and of course walking at night as well? I mean, how did anxiety and fear and the imagination of those things play into
Well, I
the way
can talk about maybe a couple of experiences where, yeah, I felt suddenly a little scared, you know.
Mm,
I was walking through the university grounds one evening and I was looking at the trees, and then there was a bench and there were some people on it in the shadows, and they were probably perfectly lovely people, but suddenly I didn't know who they were because it was dark. So they could have been anybody. That's the thing about darkness. You don't, it's so, you know, mysterious. And suddenly I felt very intimidated, maybe because they were a group. And that happened on several occasions where I stumbled upon a group and I couldn't tell whether it was a safe place for me to be or not. So I kind of moved on. But I was aware that those people were probably just having a nice time or having a chat with each other. There was nothing necessarily to be scared of, but it was just the unknown. I don't know if that helps.
It's interesting because it also plays on something that I thought immediately when I saw Jill's photographs in the cottages, and that's this very strange sense of claustrophobia and anxiety that certainly I feel when I go into an abandoned building. And Jill, we talked a little bit about this in our sort of pre-chat, that you had to overcome a certain level of anxiety or strangeness the first few places you went into. Can you talk about what it was like photographing in these spaces?
Yeah, I thought what was particularly interesting at the start when I started walking around looking for buildings was that there were a lot of farmers and other people around the area, but they were going about their daily work. And I was walking around looking for places, and after a while I was carrying around a massive bag of spray cans and other stuff like that, crawling in through windows. So obviously I felt like quite an oddity roaming the countryside. I was certainly at the start, I was very reticent for anyone to notice me, so I'd be ducking behind bushes and trying to make sure no one saw me. I'm sure plenty of people did. I think, yeah, one experience I had in a house, I was in there looking around and I could hear a quad bike just circling the building. So I got very nervous then, but it was just a fella checking his sheep. So, I mean, you always feel vulnerable when you're in a place where you suspect that you probably shouldn't be anyway. But yeah, everyone I met was actually quite friendly. Do you remember though, there was one night I was walking up a lane and I saw up ahead, it was a silhouette came out of the ditch holding a big shotgun. But he was just doing something practical as well. He was just looking for rabbits to shoot. So
Quite similar experiences in a way.
Yeah.
Yeah.
No actual danger.
Yeah.
But a perception of it.
But it's that perception of danger or potential danger that I think is never really very far from the back of my mind when I'm photographing. Oddly enough, for me, I mean, I live in London, so for me, it's when I'm in a more urban environment that I feel far more threatened. When I'm somewhere outside of the city, then you don't feel anywhere near as threatened. You know that the chances of someone coming up are very limited. But I suppose, both of you are putting yourselves in situations where the imagination can really run wild, and you've both said that it was imagining this danger in these spaces that was almost more kind of powerful than the danger that actually turned out, that actually emerged. I'm mindful of how quickly the time is going, but there's one more question I wanted to put to both of you. Well, there's a lot more than one, but there's one really important one. And I think this notion of a female gaze is something that has been talked about a great deal over the past few years. And it's not something that I'm entirely convinced by, but I'd like to hear your thoughts on how it intersects with your practice. Because again, one thing that I find that you're both doing is you're taking these really traditional ideas of a landscape as a space that we have a lot of room to look. A landscape is traditionally a space that's been kind of commanded by the gaze of a distanced observer. And both of you are turning that model completely around in different ways. Ruby, because photographing at night with a flash, you said you're getting very close to things. And so you are actually very confronted as a viewer by these things that are caught in the flash. And only in one or two images is there any ability to engage with the distance. And then Jill, in your work, you're engaging in these incredibly claustrophobic spaces where there really is no room for the eye to move. So I wondered if you could both sort of speak to a little bit to that idea of the female gaze, if you think, in what way, if at all, it has any resonance in your practice, and how you sort of deal with space in your photographs.
I'll go if you like. I suppose I've thought about the close-up quite a lot over the past years, and that idea of the haptic, and also that idea of kind of moving in closely as opposed to taking a distant view, of the surveyor, or, looking out over the landscape from almost like a romantic or Renaissance perspective. It was often to do with like ownership over land. And so I have thought about how the close-up really does something different, or, even going into a cropped frame brings the viewer a lot closer to the material of what's in the image. And, things like the texture that gives us a more sensory feeling. So I don't know if that's a female gaze. I'm sure there's other photographers who use that too. I know Steve McQueen uses a lot of close-up photography, so it might not be a particularly female thing, but definitely to activate the senses. And then the idea of the flaneur or the flaneuse, just that idea of the man having the privilege to wander around and observe and be the voyeur, and sort of transgressing that role in a subtle way by being able to wander and take images as a woman. And like you said, there's been a lot of talk about the female gaze and, taking back the gaze, or what it is. Do we want to be looked at? Do we want to be able to disappear into the crowd? What that gaze means. So yeah, those things are things I definitely think about in terms of the work.
I mean, both of your practices invite a kind of invisibility as well. I mean, for both of you, that idea of not being seen in a way is kind of an important part of it. Particularly for Jill, you said it was right from the beginning. But I wanted to just sort of push on this idea, Jill, in your practice of this claustrophobic feeling. Is that something that you were kind of thinking about when you were working in these environments? Because of course, what you do with these interventions you create is that you transform them even further from three-dimensional spaces into something quite two-dimensional. In many of them, you do actually lose a sense visually of this kind of space you're inside.
Yeah, the images I produce don't represent the sense of space inside these places at all. Yeah, I was very deliberate, especially with the cottages project. So I chose a square format, the really harsh lighting, the flattening effect, obviously, and the introduction of other elements. The rural pheasant was a slightly different scenario, because it was mostly, as I said, done on my father's farm, and the buildings there, well, I was looking for places where I could keep out of his way, in a way, I guess, because it is very much a place of work for him, whereas I was just wandering around doing what I wanted, getting in his way. But I did eventually kind of branch out a little bit and do more sort of outdoor or bigger interventions.
The thing about those interventions that I find most fascinating is the way that they really, again, they play with the sense of space, but in a different way. I remember when I first saw them, I thought that this had been done in post-production. There's this real sense of something having been imposed on the space, after the fact. And it's really, in many of them, I had to look really hard to work out that you have actually created these interventions in the spaces themselves.
No, it was something I enjoyed doing, was imposing my my view, I guess, on these landscapes, because there is a great sense of freedom being able to do that, being able to impose your will like that, only briefly.
And you're the maker as well. You're like the maker and the sculptor, and sort of bringing that artistic practice into the photographic realm, which is interesting too, I think.
Yeah. Well, we've got about 20 minutes left and we've got about 8 questions here. Was there any, wow, that was a really loud firework. Was there anything that you both wanted to say just to wind up before we go to the questions?
Well, thanks for a great chat and pointing out some really interesting observations on the practices. It's really been interesting. I haven't showed this work before, so it's really interesting to be able to discuss it like this with you. So,
yeah, thank you. And it's
yeah.
interesting to compare our two similar approaches, or similar but different approaches to exploring.
Yeah, your approaches are very different, but I mean, I guess that's just the way that I look at things. You know, I'm always looking for kind of affinities, but there are a lot of affinities between the ways you work, and some really interesting points of contrast as well. Okay, so I'm opening up the Q&A window, and I'll just go with the one that's on the top. Ruby, besides being aware of threat, did you alter your body language, your equipment, and how you dressed and moved throughout the city at night?
Good question. Yeah, I did actually. I started to wear a UV vest, which is more like a work person would, and I also adopted the bicycle, so I could get more quickly in and out of situations. So I would be able to stop in places, take pictures, and then jump back on the bike or wheel it along and walk as I pleased. But I felt that if suddenly I needed to move fast, I could. And that's made me feel a lot better about working as well.
It's strange how that high-vis jacket has become a kind of an emblem of officialness, you know?
Yeah.
That in a way that something that makes you so highly visible should actually make you almost invisible.
Yeah, you join the working masses as well when you've got your UV, your high vis on.
Yeah.
So you could be fixing something or, doing a useful task.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
I used to wear one as well, photographing in certain places in London.
Yeah. It's a really useful costume to wear.
Absolutely. And if you had a clipboard, I mean, nobody says anything.
Yeah, you look official as well.
Yeah.
So thanks for that question.
This is a question for Jill from Irina Backlin. How important was the element of taking control over a scene, placing yourself clearly and boldly into the view? Were the interventions an immediate reaction to what you saw, or were you pre-imagining the image sometimes?
Oh yeah, it was very important. That it was all about me. I just had to get myself in there. It's partly just the way that I view taking photographs. By staging these interventions and kind of absolving myself of the need to take any responsibility for the representation of the subject matter involved. It wasn't entirely spontaneous. I'd sort of seek out the locations first, take photos of them and print them out and draw on them. But there was an element of spontaneity in it, and I had to sort of adapt at the time to whatever was there, and throwing things around the place as well and trying to catch them with the flash. So that's always unpredictable.
Was there ever any feeling that you were kind of vandalizing these places? Did you ever feel, oh, I shouldn't be doing this? I mean, is there an element of kind of transgression in that?
Yeah, at the start, it was very much a selfish impulse. Once I started asking farmers, talking to them about it, though, they were all incredibly happy for me to do it. So, that kind of absolved that guilt.
Yeah. Okay. Here's a question. This is for both of you. Do you take inspiration from other photographers or artists? If so, do you have any recommendations for my own research?
Well, I wonder what the person's own research is.
Yeah. They haven't said.
Yeah. Absolutely. Yeah. Plenty of photographers and filmmakers and writers. It's so important, I think, as an artist to absorb from all the other work around you. It's important to realize that you are part of something, as in you're not making an individual or unique work. You're actually absorbing all the the practices of your peers as well, and it being inspired by them. Jill, of course, is one person I'm inspired by, and I often talk about students, about two students about her work, because I think she's been doing things that are really interesting, and it's really good for them to, when they come to Ireland, if they come from the States or internationally, to see somebody working with the Irish landscape in a very contemporary way.
Thank you.
Yeah, so there's plenty. Jill, how about you?
Well, if you're speaking specifically about interventions in architecture, I guess the hero for that is Gordon Matta Clark. He made huge building cuts and turned these buildings into sculptures themselves. And John Devola was an important influence. He did very similar work, making unspecific, meaningless interventions in a way in abandoned buildings. I wish I could say that I had some women influences making these work, but not yet. So if people can recommend some, that would be brilliant.
Yeah. Okay. Question for Ruby. Well, we know the answer to Jill's because you've shown us a picture. Ruby, do you use a tripod? Do you use a professional camera or an iPhone?
I use a professional camera. It's a Fuji X-T3, which I got recently. Before that, I used to work a lot more with film. So suddenly this has kind of liberated me, being able to move quicker and take images in much lower light conditions. I haven't used a tripod because of the reason that I mentioned about having to move quickly, but it is something I've thought about as well. I quite like the snapshot aesthetic that I've been developing in the work. So I haven't actually used a tripod yet, but I know there's some times when I could probably get a better quality image if I did that. But it's still work in progress, so still experimenting with that.
Do you know the work of Ruth Blies Luxemburg, her really early work, the very first stuff that she did? She was going around London, this would have been in the late 90s, I guess, at night with a large format camera on a tripod, and setting up, I mean, in places that I was even terrified to walk through. Mind you, I was a bit sort of, lame in that respect, but she was just bravely marching into, the middle of Croydon and places like that, setting up a large format camera with a tripod at 11 o'clock at night and just leaving the shutter open for however many minutes.
Wow.
I remember thinking when I heard her talk about it once, and she was saying no, she never had any trouble at all. And I remember thinking that she was either very brave or very foolish, probably a bit of both.
Yeah, and then I was thinking of like Diane Arbus as well, moving through the city, and just confronting her own fear. And apparently she was a very shy person, and she just used to stop and take pictures of people. And that was also kind of a type of flaneuserie in a way.
Absolutely, yeah, that's very present in her work.
Yeah.
There's one for Jill. It's a little bit like the question you've already had. How did you decide what to do as interventions in the space?
Well, I knew the range of materials I'd be working with. So anything bright, shiny, spray painty, glittery. I would take into account what was already in the building. So if there was interesting colors or textures. Sometimes there were even landscape pictures hanging on the wall still. So if there were, I would reference those.
Yeah. Did you ever take anything out of the spaces as souvenirs?
No. I mean, usually I'm quite avaricious, but no, I didn't consider, well, no. I figured everything should just stay there.
Yeah. Okay. The next two questions are quite similar, actually. So I'm going to read them both to you, and I think they're addressed to both of you. The first one is, what emotions did you experience on your journeys through your projects? Did you feel any attachments? And the second question is, does the sense of danger you feel photographing alone in spaces where you're not supposed to be affect the work? Do you think, for example, that leads to a heightened sense of awareness? Ruby, I think you have actually said in a way that it does. Or perhaps you feel you need to get, you feel you need to get what you need quickly and leave. So in that sense, that's a really interesting question, actually. You know, this sense of needing to get a photograph quickly and leaving, I find it very difficult to work under those circumstances. And I'm aware that both of you, I think, probably have felt that way at some point. And has that affected the way you work or the quality of your work, for instance?
Well, you go first, if you like, Jill.
It might have done, but I didn't consider it too important because I think the feeling of getting over the fear and of doing something that was worth going through the fear was, yeah, something that definitely helped and I enjoyed maybe after the fact.
Mm-hmm.
I think there's been an element of playfulness with what I've been doing. And I've been trying to work with that, as in I don't know exactly where it's going or if it's, you know, what exactly I'm doing. And it's more about playing and experimentation and trying to let that fluidity in, maybe after a long period of study where everything was so kind of thought through and, you know, almost stultifying, that it's been really nice to do something really playful and just see what the camera can do and keep on experimental, I suppose, experimenting with it. And trying to make it as experiential as possible. And then maybe then it comes down to editing later when you look at the images and see how did they work, and then reflecting on them is a hugely important process when you work like that. So yeah, certainly you want to get in and get out sometimes. And lately I've been going out in the rain as well, because I found that was quite a nice extra effect of adding a lot of lusciousness to the plants. You know, they were wet, and then there was some different kind of raindrops in the images and things like that, which I wasn't expecting. So sort of being ready for the unexpected in the work, but also slightly knowing what I was looking for as well, if that makes sense. There's a mix, I suppose.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So as the project has evolved, you've found that there are certain environments, certain types of subject matter that respond better, or that give a result that you know you're going to be happy with, or that you think you might be more happy with?
Yeah, I think I focused more in on hedgerows and sort of odd everyday things as the project developed.
Yeah.
Rather than street views and, you know, trees from a distance and things like that, that were more at the beginning of the project. It seems like I've got closer and closer into the undergrowth or something. And looking at odd things like flowers and things that just stick out of the undergrowth and maybe have some colors as well.
Okay, here's a question. This is an interesting one. Is there, and this is for both of you, is there anything in the landscape that you have not yet photographed but would like to? And I suppose it's in a way, it's a very different question for both of you, because Jill, it seems that your practice involves, I guess, more forward planning, in the sense of, you know, knowing that you need to find spaces to intervene in. Does your practice always depend on that? Does there always have to be an intervention involved? Have you felt tempted to make work without intervening in the landscape first?
No, except for my own enjoyment, I guess. And yeah, I guess I photograph within a landscape, but not necessarily the landscape. No, I don't think there is anything at the minute that I'd consider something I'd want to take pictures of.
Yeah,
I think I exhausted it after spending months running around after my dad and other farmers trying to catch them doing stuff. So
yeah.
Well, I've wondered about the sea, but I think it will be a very different space, just because I've started swimming as well in lockdown, and a few times we've had night swims. So I've kind of wondered, is there any way that I could use the camera to photograph that? But other than that, I want to carry on with what I'm doing and see keep reflecting on it and experimenting with it and see what emerges.
There's a question here that I want to maybe leave right for the end, because it's quite a provocative one, but it's a really interesting one to think about. Before that, let's see. This is something I noticed as well. Some of Ruby's images have a vertical thrusting element. Was this deliberate?
No, it wasn't, but it is funny, especially the pylons.
Yeah.
And I found this book, The Feminist City, and she talks a lot about pylons and architecture as being very phallic, and you know, that the city is actually quite phallic often in the way it's put together with skyscrapers, and she goes into it. So I thought, then I started drawing a parallel with that too, and the sort of, like, I suppose the strangeness of that being part of this close-up approach and the intimate approach, and then these sort of hard phallic like structures coming in as well. So yeah, just teasing those things out.
Okay. Here's one for both of you. How much does writing inform your work? Does it help to contextualize it, etc.?
I feel I need to write to contextualize, but I find it very difficult, quite an incoherent person. So it is important, but I'd avoid it if I could.
So do you do it out of a sense of obligation?
Well, I mean, it does help order your thoughts. It's necessary for that too.
Yeah.
Yeah, definitely.
Otherwise, it'd just be reacting. So.
Yeah. There's another question that's kind of linked into this that's just got another upvote. It says, does your work start in research or more with instinctive image taking?
Yeah, instinctive, and possessive.
Possessive, yeah, you use that word a lot. It's really interesting. This need to make a space your own, to kind of control it in a way.
Yeah.
Totally get that.
Definitely research is a big factor, and I think, you know, of course it kind of feeds everything, and then there's an important part of letting that research emerge and being able to, like, play, as I said, and let those things come out in the work, and not just make it informed by theory, or, you know, just kind of let those things permeate through and be able to put them to the side. And like you said, Jill, writing is such an important way to order your thoughts and, you know, reflect as well. It's a very reflective process. This kind of practice and then reflection seem to be really important, that they go together and they have different times.
Yeah. And Ruby, literature seems to play certainly in your presentation, there are a lot of references to literature that really kind of enriched the way I experienced the practice as well. So reading is part, you know, when people think research, they commonly think, oh, visual research, but I think reading, even reading things like novels.
Absolutely, yeah.
Really kind of enriches the sense of what you're doing.
Yeah, you can be fed by other things than other artworks and photographs. It can be books and films and the whole myriad, the spectrum.
Yeah,
definitely. So whatever, I suppose, kind of provokes the imagination and sparks the interest to keep going. And when you realize that, you know, something is tapping in, like the writer Felina Sun, when she sent me the essay, it was really energizing that somebody was responding like that and also walking themselves. And the essay kind of weaves back and forth between her experiences and her imagined experiences that I was having, and then weaves different references in. So it was great to work like that.
There's about 4 or 5 more questions left. I'm not sure if Michael's going to let us go a little bit over time. If he's not, then I guess we'll just disappear in mid-response, but I'm going to try and get to them anyways. It's interesting that actually I'm going to ask you both this one. This is we can talk for as long as we like. I'm not going to go on for too long, because I'm mindful that people have other things to get on with in their evening, but just a few really interesting questions to wind up with. An anonymous attendee has said, surely danger exists for everyone. wandering around any environment at night, or an environment like those Jill is encountering, must pose a threat for any photographer.
I totally agree with that. I mean, the reason that I'm concentrating on a female perspective is because I am female, but I'm extremely aware of how much violence is there for all genders.
Yeah.
And men often get preyed upon in very violent ways. And also, every gender, every sexual person and being. So the reason I'm doing it, as I said, it's just because it's me and I'm looking at it from my personal perspective.
Yeah.
So
yeah, no, I agree with Ruby. It's just a matter of perspective. Partly what we're taught to expect, and partly what we're told. So no, I don't think there's any difference in the dangers.
yeah, and I think if I ever spoke about this project, I would want to preface it with that thought as well.
Yeah,
I feel that very strongly.
I think it's absolutely certain that there are dangers for anyone. I think we do face slightly different kinds of dangers, though. The sort of violence that is enacted on women is quite different, I think, from the sort of violence that is enacted on men, and the kinds of provocations that you face.
Yeah, that's the thing. It's sexual violence statistically is what we're prey to much more.
Yeah.
And that's just statistical.
Yeah.
And men are more preyed on for just acts of just random violence,
Yeah.
which is terrifying as well.
Yeah. I mean, both are terrifying in their own ways.
Yeah.
Okay. Have you found the enforcement of regulations on movement to be challenging for your practices? This is for both of you. And for your moods or emotions. If the situation continues, do you have plans for how to manage future work?
How about you, Jill?
I'm not really working in this way anymore, but I was aware when I was doing the projects, they were close to home, that I wouldn't have the same freedom to wander around in a place where people didn't know who I was. And also these kind of freedoms in the countryside are going now anyway. So
in what sense?
People just more suspicion of strangers or being where you're not supposed to be. That might just be coming from people that you might not feel the same sense that you're allowed to walk up random roads or down people's driveways. So I do worry that kind of thing is going.
It's something that I noticed very strongly moving from Canada to England.
Yeah.
I mean, Canada's an enormous country, and it's very easy to wander places and to see nobody and not to feel at all restricted. And it's one of the first things I noticed when I got to Southeast England was how you were constantly under somebody's eye.
You notice that more in England as well. I think we have a lot more space here.
Okay.
Yeah, it's just less populated. So, you definitely, when you're in the UK, you feel that presence all the time.
Yeah.
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 Just in terms of that question, there was a project that I was doing with another artist and writer, Michaela Kutaya, and it was going to be about walking along the coastline of the Connemara coastline. We'd been visiting an archive and we were going to walk. So I haven't been able to do that over the past 6 months or so as planned. And this project emerged kind of instead because of being in such a closer sphere. The 5 kilometer lockdown, and we're back in it now. So, that's what's happening. And who knows what's going to happen? We don't know.
I'm impressed you've been able to make a project during the lockdown. To be honest, I haven't been able to do anything.
A lot of artists say that they're just absolutely, they can't make anything. I've heard a lot of people saying that.
Yeah.
I've been photographing I'm really lucky to live right on the very edge of London in Zone 6. And I've got enormous stretches of sort of nature preserves around me, and I've been taking the time just to discover them, and some of them are fascinating. They're sort of, wild in their essence, but obviously very, very highly managed. And I've been photographing them extensively.
Brilliant. That's something you really notice, actually, the noticing thing.
Yeah.
What is around. But I probably would have just been so busy, I would have gone by, if it wasn't for lockdown.
Yeah, exactly.
You
And
know.
I think of a project like John Gossage's The Pond, which is this incredibly banal environment that, or outwardly banal environment that he returned to repeatedly and found more and more interesting things to do or to see every time he was there.
Yeah, I really like that idea of banality
Yeah.
and of noticing,
Okay. Here's another question for Ruby. How do you define dark? Did you consider how the phases of the moon would impact your images?
Well, that's a nice question. A very good question. I haven't really thought about. Of course, there are different shades of darkness as the month goes by, and it's just nice to reflect on that. I haven't defined darkness yet, but of course, depending on the time of night, it might just be getting dark and dusk. There's all these gradations of it, which have been interesting to work with. And then there's the thick, heavy darkness. And when you get out into rural areas, there's the absolutely inky blackness of no streetlights and everything. So it's a nice idea to reflect on. So I'll take that one with me.
For Jill, are you a possessive person in other parts of your life? Does the intervention in your work help with that? So that's a little bit personal.
Yeah, there.
I wonder if we can frame that in a way that's a little less personal.
I'm not at all. I'd be the opposite. I'm a very passive and generally don't like to make an impact on any sort of scenario that I'm in. So photography is obviously a way I'm letting this out.
Your hidden possessiveness.
Yes, so yeah.
Okay. There's two more left. There's one that's directed to Ruby, and then there's a last one also for Ruby, but I think it would be a really nice way to round out and just finish with a question for both of you. Oh my goodness, and someone's just put up a really, really long question. Let's get to this one first, which has been here for a while. It's interesting that Ruby chose to make images in the dark and using a flash. Was that in order to interact with the space and nature and make it your own?
I think it was. Yeah, I think it was. I tried out lots of different things, like not using the flash and just concentrating on much more shady, shadowy, low grade, like kind of like technically very scratchy. So I've got tons of stuff, actually. The ones that I've showed you are the ones that I've picked out, but I've zoomed in and gone close to things. And I really like the flash because it kind of spotlights things and it gives that kind of edginess that flash does. It kind of takes it out of the real a little bit, doesn't it? Gives it a accentuated quality. I suppose that's why fashion photographers love it as well, because the plants are like models in the flashlight.
And at night time as well, because I go camping on my own sometimes, and it's a little bit creepy in the woods all on your own. But when you put a head torch on and you create this little bubble of light around you, somehow you kind of contract the space and you create this, like, it's almost like a little zone of safety. And it's a completely psychological thing, obviously. But there is that as well, that idea that the flash is creating this little bubble of kind of personal space in this otherwise quite large and slightly threatening space whose limits and edges you can't really see.
Yeah, it's really true. It creates a little pool of light suddenly in the darkness, and
yeah.
Like that thought.
The last one is actually not a question, it's more of an observation. As a man who has made photographs in abandoned buildings and places, I would be conscious of structural dangers in the sense that a floor or wall could give way, very true. the fact of my trespassing, the knowledge that I would more than likely have gone off alone without telling anyone where I was, and also the possibility of encountering people who may have made temporary homes or hangouts in these locations. It hasn't stopped me, but it's in the back of my mind all the time. I guess, Jill, have you ever encountered anyone else in these houses?
No, I haven't. I've been accused of living in one, all right, but it wasn't me.
Okay.
Yeah, someone had a stranger living in their abandoned building nearby, I guess.
Yeah.
But no, it was only birds and like rats and bats, things like that. I was always fairly cautious. Obviously, I didn't want to hurt myself. So no one would know where I was. But I mean, sometimes you have to go upstairs to see what's there. So
Yeah. Yeah. And I suppose because you're in a fairly rural area that there's less chance of people being in those buildings as well. I know that abandoned buildings in the city will almost always have somebody else living in them at the time, or, you know.
yeah, I never ran into anyone in them. Sometimes outside them. So I'd have to quickly explain what I was doing there. But yeah.
Okay, well, I'm going to finish up with a question for both of you. It's from John, Duncan, Ruby, and Jill also. Could you talk about the different strategies that you have used when you're exhibiting your work? And he said for Ruby, for instance, in unfixed landscapes. But I suppose I would like just to finish up by putting the question out to both of you.
Mhm.
Because you are both working with space and with closeness and distance and certain sort of relationships between open space and enclosed space. So I would think that how the work gets seen and the environment, the conditions under which it's displayed would play into that in quite strong ways.
Mm.
Can you
Well,
talk
I haven't
about that?
exhibited this work yet, but the unfixed landscape, I was really experimenting with installation. There was a lot of video work in it as well. So I was playing between the still and moving image. And one of the pieces had an actual tent. So that was like a sculptural piece of itself, like an old army tent. And then there were videos projected inside. And then I had a table with a lot of photographs in it under glass, because I like the idea of the horizontal viewing plane, because it kind of fitted with the concept that I was working with, rather than having wall-based work. So trying to experiment with how the images, the images projected or placed on paper, you know, in different ways, and sort of bringing the viewer in to a more intimate viewing plane with smaller works, and then expanding it. So I'm really interested in installation, but I haven't installed this current work yet.
Yeah. Okay. And what about you, Jill?
I've just realized I lied to you earlier. I did take some things out of the houses. I took landscapes, like pictures if I find them.
Yeah.
So I sometimes, I exhibited those alongside my own images, just to sort of extend the notion of the romantic Irish landscape.
Well, we were in a show together as well in Minnesota. Yeah.
Right. I'm obviously keen on installation too. It's obviously the obvious extension of the kind of intervention work that I do. But I haven't done anything too interesting yet, I don't think so.
Yeah, you've got some very cool stuff up on your website. The news project that you haven't talked about yet. I think it probably,
Being a bit more experimental with that, right? Trying to build things.
Yeah. Using a lot of paint and they're very painterly.
Yeah.
Okay, well, we've gone about almost 15 minutes over time, and I'm mindful that people probably have evenings to get on with. So we probably wind the talk up. I want to thank you both for just being really, really generous in sharing your thoughts and your practice. And thank you to everyone who's turned up as well. It's been brilliant seeing such a nice turnout. Really appreciate it.
Thank you so much for all your interesting questions and thoughts and observations.
Oh, no,
Thank you.
it's been an absolute pleasure.
It's been really nice to talk to people again.
Yeah, it's so true.
Yeah.
Thanks to Michael as well for inviting us. I look forward
Yes.
to the next talks.
Yeah, thank you, Michael. And thank you
Thank
for
you.
some amazing questions from everybody. That's been
Thanks.
brilliant.
Really great questions. Yeah.
All right.
Thanks
Good
a
night,
lot.
everyone.
Okay, good night.
Bye.